Good evening, and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. Tonight, in our event story, we invite you to remember not just a day that shook the world, but the divine fingerprints left behind in its aftermath. Some stories of history are written in smoke and steel, but others are etched into the human soul. When the towers fell, her world collapsed, but what she found 10 years later changed everything. This is the story of September 11th and the War on Terror. Not as a newsreel or a headline, but as a living, breathing memory carried by mothers, soldiers, imams, chaplains, and strangers who crossed paths in the firelight of crisis. What did it do to our faith, our families, our future, and in the ashes, did we lose God or finally hear Him? At 8:46 a.m. on September 11th, 2001, New York stood under a sapphire sky. Crystal clear, innocent, ordinary. The kind of morning you forget unless it changes your life. In Brooklyn Heights, Eleanor Ruiz, a 63-year-old retired public school teacher, opened her Bible on the porch. She read a passage from Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, a time to break down, and a time to build up. She had no idea how prophetic that line would become in the next 90 minutes. Miles away in Lower Manhattan, thousands began their routines. Swiping coffee, kissing foreheads, checking emails, and 3,000 feet above them, a plane silently entered the skyline. Then came the fire, the screaming, the silence. The second plane hit at 9:03, and just like that, reality unraveled. Across the Hudson River, Rashid Khan, a Pakistani-American taxi driver who had immigrated 6 years earlier, stared at the smoke through his windshield. He had just dropped off a passenger near the financial district. In the days to come, Rashid wouldn't just fear the terrorists, he'd fear his neighbors. Within hours of the towers falling, a second war began. This one on trust, identity, and fear of the other. Mosques were vandalized, turbans mistaken for threats. And Rashid, he was called a traitor in line at the grocery store. Even though he had lost 2 regular clients in the South Tower that morning, 2 Jewish brothers he'd driven for 5 years, he never said a word in defense. But that Friday, he left a white rose at the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral, alone. In Arlington, Virginia, the Pentagon smoldered. But inside the mind of Captain Sarah Leeds, a 29-year-old Christian Army officer newly assigned to military intelligence, a war had already started. For months after September 11th, Sarah struggled with the whispers of duty and faith colliding. She wanted to protect her country, but something in her spirit whispered, not all battles are meant to be fought with bombs. And when her assignment came, to be deployed to a forward base in Bagram, Afghanistan, she didn't feel pride. She felt unease. And yet she said yes, not out of fear, not out of revenge, but because she had to know, had to see, had to understand the face behind the fire. In the days that followed the attacks, the world became a map of grief. Flags lined porches, blood banks overflowed, prayers filled Times Square, and in that strange, united sorrow, something holy flickered. For just a moment, we weren't left or right, Muslim or Christian, civilian or soldier. We were human, raw, wounded, searching. But the years would test that unity. As the war on terror spread across continents and decades, questions grew heavier than bombs. Did we respond out of justice or vengeance? Did we find peace or just postpone the pain? And most haunting of all, what did we become in the process? This story does not answer those questions for you. It lets you sit with them, because in the chapters ahead, you will meet those who lived it, not to retell history, but to whisper what it taught them about mercy, judgment, forgiveness, and fate. In the weeks after the towers fell, funerals outnumbered weddings. Air was thicker, conversations shorter. Everyone seemed to speak in lowered voices, like the world itself was in mourning. But in a quiet corner of Queens, Imam Yusuf Darzi, 44, stood before a shattered congregation. His mosque had been spray-painted 3 nights in a row. His daughter, a 6th grader named Amina, had her hijab ripped off at school. And yet that Friday, he delivered a sermon on love. "When you are cursed," he said, "bless in return. When you are struck, pray for your attacker. Because God watches the tested most carefully." One woman in the back began to cry. She wasn't Muslim. She'd never entered a mosque before. But her husband had died in Tower 2. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she had wandered into the mosque that morning, heart raw and searching for something that didn't look like vengeance. She would return the next week, and the next. And 3 years later, she'd be the co-founder of a food pantry run, jointly by the mosque and a local synagogue, because something in the pain whispered, "Heal, don't harden." Thousands of miles away, in Kandahar, Afghanistan, dust curled around a convoy of American Humvees. Among them rode specialist Travis Dean, a 22-year-old from Jackson, Mississippi. He had never left the South before, had never spoken to a Muslim, had never heard the call to prayer echo through mountains. He joined the army to make someone pay for September 11th. But in his 3rd week of patrol, he met a boy named Samir. Samir had lost a leg in a roadside blast meant for Travis's unit. Instead of fleeing, Travis lifted him into the back of their truck and stayed with him through 2 surgeries. For the rest of his deployment, Travis visited Samir's village weekly, bringing food, helping with repairs, learning Pashto. He started to see the faces behind the flags, the humanity behind the headlines. When Travis returned to Mississippi, he didn't talk much about combat, but he did show pictures. One of them, framed by his fireplace, shows him and Samir holding a cricket bat together. The caption reads, Not every battle is about winning. Back in Manhattan, Elena Ruiz, the retired teacher who opened her Bible that morning, began keeping a journal. She wrote one line each day, not about politics, not about war, but about kindness. A man gave up his seat on the subway for a mother with 2 children. A teenager offered to carry my groceries upstairs. A Sikh neighbor shoveled snow from the fire station driveway. Every act became a psalm, a testament to the fact that, even in tragedy, grace is not erased, it is revealed. Meanwhile, the drums of war grew louder. Iraq was invaded. Flags waved again. Some cheered, others wept, and many, quietly, began to wonder, where does this path lead? Because for all the smoke and speeches, something deeper stirred underneath. It wasn't just a war of nations. It was a war of souls. In 2005, Captain Sarah Leeds stood on the tarmac at Bagram Air Base, her boots crunching frost. She had seen operations, interrogations, civilian deaths, but what haunted her most was the look in a young girl's eyes, a girl who had just lost her mother in a drone strike. The girl said nothing. She just stared at Sarah, not with hate, not with fear, but with a question too big for words. Why? That night, Sarah wrote a letter to herself. She never mailed it. If I forget the value of one soul, I've lost the war already. She began attending evening prayer with the chaplain, not out of guilt, but because she couldn't carry it alone. These are not headlines. These are heartbeat memories. From Kabul to Kansas, from Brooklyn to Baghdad. This was not just a conflict. It was a reckoning. And the stories were only beginning. By the time 5 years had passed since the towers fell, the dust had settled, but the divisions had deepened. The flags were still there, but so were the questions. Was this still about justice, or had we wandered into something else? In a small town outside Toledo, Ohio, a boy named Aaron Campbell turned 13. His father, Doug Campbell, had died as a firefighter in the North Tower, one of the last to enter before it collapsed. Doug had been a quiet man, faithful, methodical, the kind of dad who built tree houses and prayed before every meal. When Aaron was little, he'd call his father a superhero. But by 13, Aaron was angry. Angry at the world, angry at Muslims, angry at God. One Sunday, his mother caught him tearing pages out of his father's old Bible. He prayed, Aaron said through tears, and it didn't save him. His mother, Rachel, sat beside him. She didn't quote scripture. She just held him and whispered, "God didn't ignore your dad's prayer. He answered it by helping him save others before the end." Later that night, Aaron opened the Bible again. One page he'd torn still sat loose in his lap. It read, "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." That same year, in Baghdad, a U.S. Army chaplain named Matthew DeLoach stood inside the ruins of a bombed-out church. He had come to deliver supplies, but when he arrived, he saw something that shook him. There, among shattered pews and burnt icons, sat a local priest named Father Fadi, hands clasped, eyes closed, humming an ancient hymn in Aramaic. Matt asked him, "Why do you stay here?" The priest opened his eyes and replied softly, "If I leave, who will mourn the ones no one remembers?" Later, Matt would write in his journal, "Faith is not escaping the fire. It's standing in it, with hope." He stopped seeing himself as a visitor in a foreign land. He started seeing himself as part of a shared suffering, one that transcended uniforms and borders. Meanwhile, in Dearborn, Michigan, a 17-year-old girl named Amina Dazi, yes, the same girl whose hijab had been torn off at school, stood on stage at her high school's interfaith forum. She was nervous. Her hands trembled behind the podium. But when she spoke, her voice rang clear. "My father taught me that our pain is not a wall, it is a bridge. And if you let fear build the wall, you will never see the person on the other side." The room fell silent. A Christian student in the back stood up and clapped. Then another. Then another. A month later, the school launched its first joint day of reflection, bringing students from all backgrounds together to share stories of faith, fear, and resilience. Across the ocean, in a tiny village in Helmand Province, specialist Travis Dean was watching Samir run again, thanks to a donated prosthetic from the U.S. Medical Corps. Travis had pushed for it, filled out every form, used every connection. He didn't tell anyone. He just showed up one day, holding the box with the leg inside like it was made of gold. When Samir stood upright for the first time, wobbling but upright, the entire village clapped. His grandmother kissed Travis's hands. That night, under a desert sky, Travis whispered, "Lord, if I did nothing else right over here, thank you for letting me do this." Back in New York, Eleanor Ruiz kept writing her daily notes, but now she had begun sharing them online, one line each day. She called it The Ashes of Grace. One day she wrote, "Today I saw a Muslim boy holding a candle at Ground Zero. No one looked away." That post would be shared over 200,000 times, because quietly, something was changing. The pain hadn't gone. The war hadn't ended, but hearts were beginning to soften. By 2011, a decade had passed. The country had changed. The skyline had changed, but grief, that had simply evolved. It no longer screamed. It sat quietly in rooms, in folded flags, in birthdays missed, in dinner tables with one less plate. And then, on May 2nd, 2011, the news broke. Osama bin Laden was dead. Across the country, crowds flooded the streets, chanting, waving flags, singing, "God Bless America." For many, it was a release. a closing of a wound, justice at last, but not for everyone. In a small home in San Antonio, Texas, Chaplain Matthew DeLoach turned off the TV and sat in silence. He thought of Father Fadi in Baghdad. He thought of the Afghan villagers who had lost their homes. He thought of the American soldiers who died looking for the man now buried at sea. He whispered, "So many ghosts." That night, Matthew wrote in his journal, "We caught a man, but not the rage that made him. We ended a life, but did we restore any?" He prayed for both nations. He prayed for his son, now 8 years old, who had grown up with war on the news like background noise. And he prayed for his own heart, not to grow numb. In New York, Aaron Campbell was now 18. He visited the new 9/11 memorial with his mother, standing where his father once rushed into fire. It was quiet there, only the sound of water. As he traced his father's name etched in bronze, a soft drizzle began to fall. His mother handed him a folded piece of paper. "He wrote this for you before he left that morning." Aaron opened it. "Son, if I don't come home tonight, know that I lived for something bigger than me. Love others more than they deserve, and always remember, God doesn't waste pain. I'll see you again. Dad." Aaron folded the letter. Something cracked open in him. Not just sorrow, but peace. He went home that night and applied to seminary. Meanwhile, in Kabul, Sarah Leeds, now Captain Leeds, sat across from a tribal elder in a dusty council hut. She had extended her deployment voluntarily, but her mission had changed. No longer intelligence. Now, reconciliation work, listening, translating, negotiating ceasefires. The elder, a man with weathered hands and a Quran by his side, asked her, "Why does an American woman risk her life for people not her own?" Sarah smiled faintly. "Because my God doesn't have borders." He nodded slowly, then said something she'd never forget. Perhaps the war is not between nations, but between those who remember God and those who forget. Back in Dearborn, Amina Darzi, now in college, wrote her senior thesis on interfaith trauma and healing. Her conclusion? That the war on terror didn't just target bombs or borders. It tested identity, compassion, faith. She included a story from her childhood, the hijab pulled off her head, the silence that followed, and the slow rebuilding of trust. In the shadow of terror, she wrote, "Some chose hate, others chose healing. I am the daughter of both wounds and wonder." Her professor asked if she planned to publish it. She said no. "I plan to teach it, to live it." And in Brooklyn, Eleanor Ruiz lit a candle. She was older now, frailer, but still writing. She opened her notebook to page 3652. Today's entry. A young Muslim man helped an elderly veteran cross the street in front of me. They smiled at each other. That's it. That's the story. She smiled because sometimes the most powerful words are the quietest. The years rolled forward, slow and heavy. For many, life resumed its rhythm. School buses, mortgages, promotions. But for those who had truly lived within the storm, the echoes never stopped. In Fresno, California, an ex-Marine named Travis Dean now ran a small construction company. He hired mostly veterans, men with missing limbs, night terrors, and nowhere else to go. Every Friday, he held a cookout behind the shop. No uniforms, no ranks, just laughter, ribs, and a picnic table worn down by stories. But once a year, on September 11th, Travis sat alone with an old photo. Him and Samir, smiling under Afghan sun. Samir's arm around his waist, his new leg barely visible in the sand. Travis never heard from Samir again after he left. But every time he built a home for a struggling family, he'd whisper, "This one's for you, buddy." In Baghdad, Father Fadi still preached, though his congregation had shrunk. Many had fled, some had vanished, but the cross still stood, and his voice, though hoarse, still carried weight. One night after service, a young American journalist approached him. "Why didn't you leave?" she asked. He looked at the broken stained glass windows and replied, "Because when the world forgets a place, that's when it needs light the most." The journalist asked if she could quote him. He said yes, but only if she wrote it by hand. "Some things," he said, "deserve more than copy-paste." In Toledo, Rachel Campbell, Aaron's mother, had started volunteering at a local refugee center. She taught English, helped with paperwork, offered tissues when the stories got too heavy. One evening, she sat across from a Syrian widow. The woman's hands trembled as she described the bombing that killed her husband and son. Rachel didn't try to fix it. She just took her hand and said, "I lost someone to terror too, but hate didn't bring him back. So I chose mercy." The woman began to cry. Later that night, Rachel wrote to Aaron, now a seminary student in Chicago. "Your father's legacy is not in how he died. It's in how we live." At the Pentagon's 9/11 memorial, Chaplain Matthew DeLoach stood beneath the stars with his son Elijah, now 16. They walked past the glowing benches, each one honoring a soul lost. Matthew paused beside one labeled Dana Falk, age 3. Elijah read the name aloud. "She was younger than me." Matthew nodded. "This is why we pray, son. Not because God guarantees safety, but because He teaches us how to carry the weight." They stood in silence for a long time. That night, Elijah posted a photo of the bench with one line, "The world forgot. We remember." Back in Dearborn, Amina Darzi had become a high school teacher. Every September, she set aside one full class period to talk about September 11th. Not from the textbook, but from the heart. She'd show them a candle, tell them about the silence, the suspicion, the rebuilding. Then she'd ask, "What does your generation want to build from this?" Some answered, unity, others, truth. One boy simply said, "Peace." And Amina smiled, because maybe the war had been long, but seeds were still being planted. Meanwhile, in her modest Brooklyn apartment, Eleanor Ruiz lit what would be her final candle. She was nearing 84. She could no longer write, but her notebook sat on her lap, open to the last page. A neighbor had begun reading her notes aloud at local schools. They called it the Ashes of Grace Project. That night, her final entry was scribbled in shaky handwriting. One world, one wound. She placed the pen down, and for the first time in 20 years, she closed the book. By 2021, it had been 20 years, 2 full decades since the planes carved scars across the skyline and into the human heart. Children born after the towers fell were now adults. Many knew the story only through history books, documentaries, or faded news clips, but some remembered the heat, the ash, the silence that followed. And in August 2021, as American troops withdrew from Afghanistan, those memories stirred again. Only this time with a haunting question. What was it all for? At a veterans center in Nashville, Travis Dean watched the news in silence. He didn't curse, he didn't shout. He just looked at the screen and whispered, "God, help those we left behind." That night, he opened a storage box in his garage. Inside, medals, letters, a photo of Samir, and a worn notebook. He flipped to the back and wrote, "The world might measure victory by land, but heaven measures it by love." Then he closed the box, and instead of turning on the TV again, he called a local Afghan refugee resettlement office. "You got any families that need drywall work or a ramp built?" "Yes," they said, surprised. "Actually, we do. I'm your guy." In Brooklyn, a new teacher had taken over Eleanor Ruiz's tradition. Her niece, Rosa, now 32, began reading The Ashes of Grace aloud at community centers. She added a few of her own notes. One read, "Pain does not expire, but neither does mercy." Rosa also started a podcast. She called it When the Sky Fell Quiet. Her first episode featured Amina Darzi, who now ran an interfaith education nonprofit. Together, they told stories of mothers and medics, of survivors and skeptics, of war and wonder. It wasn't about blame. It was about understanding. The episodes grew. So did the audience. People were still listening, still hungry to make sense of what had happened. and what hadn't healed. In Baghdad, Father Fadi finally left his church, not from fear, but from age. He handed the keys to a young Iraqi deacon, kissed the old altar, and whispered, "Keep the light on." Then he left behind a final message, scrawled on parchment paper: "You cannot bury faith beneath rubble. It rises." A photo of his empty chapel, bathed in golden light, circulated online. One user captioned it, "God doesn't leave, he waits." Back in Chicago, Aaron Campbell, now Pastor Aaron, gave a sermon on the 20th anniversary of September 11th. His church overflowed with faces, old and young, white and black, veiled and bareheaded. He didn't preach about revenge, or justice, or politics. He told them about his Father and a little note found in a Bible. "If we don't learn from pain," he said, "we pass it on. But if we let it shape us, we turn wounds into wisdom." At the end, he lit a candle on the altar, and then another and another. One for every year, one for every life, one for every grace not forgotten. In the back pew sat a man in uniform, head bowed. It was Elijah DeLoach, Matthew's son, now a military chaplain himself. He smiled, wiped a tear, and whispered, "Still watching, Dad. Still praying." The war had changed names. The flags had changed faces. But in homes, schools, churches, mosques, and memories, the questions still lingered, and the stories still mattered. In a quiet cemetery in Queens, a memorial service was being held for Eleanor Ruiz. No headlines covered it, no politicians spoke, but the small chapel overflowed. Neighbors, students, interfaith leaders, firefighters, even a few children who had never met her but had grown up reading her words online. The ashes of her life had touched more lives than she ever knew. Rosa stood at the podium, holding her aunt's worn notebook. She flipped to a page, dated September 12th, 2001. Eleanor had written, "In the smoke, a man carried a woman down 50 flights. He didn't ask what she believed. He just held her." Rosa paused. "My aunt believed the opposite of terror isn't war. It's love without condition." Then she looked at the crowd and said, "Let's not wait for disaster to remember that." After the service, a Muslim imam, a Jewish rabbi, and a Catholic priest embraced on the church steps. No one took a photo, but those who saw it would never forget. In Texas, Travis Dean drove to the home of an Afghan family who had arrived 2 months earlier. Mother, father, and 3 children. The youngest, a boy named Naveed, reminded him of Samir. Travis brought tools to fix a broken kitchen cabinet, but stayed for hours, fixing more than wood. He helped hang shelves, repaired a loose hinge. Then, in halting Dari, he asked the boy, "You like cricket?" The boy's face lit up. Travis opened his truck bed and handed him a bat, wrapped in old cloth. It was the one from Kandahar, the one from the photo. "This is for you." Naveed didn't understand the words, but he understood the kindness. And Travis, for the first time in years, felt something unexplainable. Closure that didn't come through victory, but through giving. In Washington, D.C., Elijah Deloach prepared to speak at a military remembrance event. He stepped up to the podium wearing his father's old chaplain pin. He looked at the crowd, veterans, Gold Star families, diplomats, journalists. Then he told them a story, not about battle, but about a girl who stared at his father on a tarmac in Afghanistan. She didn't hate him. She didn't cry. She just looked at him like the war was a riddle she couldn't solve. He paused, and maybe that's what it is. A riddle we've tried to answer with guns and grief. But maybe the answer was never to solve it. Maybe it was to feel it, to carry it, to remember it so deeply that we never repeat it. The room fell silent. Then he added, "My father once wrote, 'God teaches us how to carry the weight,' and I think he still is." And in Dearborn, Amina Darzi stood on a stage beside Aaron Campbell. They had been invited to deliver a joint lecture titled "Two Faiths, One Memory." Amina spoke first. "For 20 years, I've walked a tightrope between my pain and my prayer, between the weight of my scarf and the gaze it draws. But what I've learned is that I'm not alone. Grief may have different names, but the ache is shared." Aaron followed. "We all lost something that day. Some lost fathers, others peace of mind. But we also gained something, the chance to remake the world in a better image." They ended the talk holding hands. Two Americans, two faiths, one story. The audience stood. No cheers, just tears. As the night drew on somewhere in Manhattan, a candle flickered in a chapel corner. Unnoticed, uncelebrated, but burning all the same, like memory, like mercy, like God. 20 years after fire fell from the sky, after names were read and wars were waged, after heroes rose and some never came home. A different kind of war remains, not in deserts or cities, but within hearts. A war between remembering and forgetting, between healing and hardening, between becoming better or bitter. In a classroom in Brooklyn, a teacher read aloud the final words from the Ashes of Grace. "Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is remembering without the chains." She closed the book and asked her students, "What story will your generation tell?" A boy raised his hand and said that we chose love when it was hardest. And maybe that's the legacy that matters. In Afghanistan, now under new rule, the cricket bat Travis had given Naveed sat in the corner of a humble room. It was scuffed, faded, but treasured. On its handle, written in English, "You matter, always." At the 9/11 memorial, Aaron Campbell lit the 21st candle with his wife beside him and his newborn son in his arms. He whispered, "Your grandfather ran into fire so you could live with light." A breeze swept across the reflecting pools. The names on the bronze shimmered, as if even they breathed. In a church in Baghdad, a young priest read from a worn parchment once left by Father Fadi. He ended with, "Faith is not what keeps you safe. It is what keeps you standing." Outside the church, a child kicked a soccer ball with 3 others, one Muslim, one Christian, one orphaned by war. They didn't know the pain that built those walls. They only knew how to laugh near them. Maybe that's grace. Maybe that's God's way of reclaiming broken things. In Dearborn, Amina sat by her window after sunset. She held a small clay candle holder from her childhood, the same one her father lit the night of September 11th. She struck a match, watched the flame flicker, and prayed, not for protection, but for peace. "O Lord, make me a bridge." And in Brooklyn, Eleanor's final candle sat in Rosa's window. She didn't relight it this time. She let the dusk settle around it, because some flames burn longest in memory. What did September 11th teach us? That fear spreads fast, but faith moves quietly. That walls go up quickly, but bridges take time. It taught us that the worst of humanity can fall in seconds, but the best of it must be chosen again and again and again. It taught us that God doesn't always stop the fire, but He walks with us through it. And in the ruins, we sometimes find Him closer than ever. Thank you for joining us tonight, dear listener, for sitting with a story that isn't just America's, but all of ours. One of pain, mercy, anger, redemption, and yes, hope. Because even when towers fall, even when wars rage, even when the world forgets, God remembers. And so must we. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.